Massive protests in Indonesia over a move to curb freedoms as a new parliament is sworn in. Just weeks before starting his final term, popular President Joko Widodo faces an angry electorate. I'm Femi OK, you're in the stream. You can join us live on Twitter or in our YouTube chat. Tens of thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets across Indonesia over the past few weeks. They are protesting a new draft criminal law that would curtail civil liberties. If passed, it would be illegal to have premarital sex, perform black magic and insult the president, among many other things. That legislation has been postponed for now, but thousands continue to rally, demanding that officials repeal a new law that cripples Indonesia's anti-corruption body. Protesters are also concerned about human rights abuses in West Papua and raging forest fires around the country. Police are responding aggressively to the mostly student-led rallies, firing tear gas and water cannons. Hundreds have been arrested and injured, and at least 2 people have died since protests began in September. With no end to the unrest in sight, all eyes are now on Widodo to see how he tackles this crisis. Joining us to discuss this is Anindya Rastaviani from Jakarta.
Hi.
Hello there. She is a protester. Hi. Hello, good morning. The co-director of Hollaback Jakarta, which seeks to end harassment in public spaces. And we also have Nori Akhtar Riza, also joining us from Jakarta. He is a researcher for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We also invited several government officials to join us on our program, but they were not available. But it's really good to have you, Anindya and Nori. I'm going to start with a map which sort of breaks down why many people are so unhappy in Indonesia right now. Have a look at the map. You will see the big blue icons here. These are where some of the main protests have been happening on the island of Sumatra and Java, Sulawesi. Protests happening there. People also unhappy about forest fires, again, Sumatra, and on the big island, Kalimantan. And then across in West Papua, people are also upset about the continued military action there and some human rights abuses. So much going on right now in Indonesia. And India, how do you explain this moment where people are protesting not about one thing, but multiple things?
I think it's very interesting on how this developed. I think this is like a lot of accumulations from whatever. There's a lot of stuff that has been going on for so many years that we have been protesting. We have been doing a lot of advocacy efforts. And, like when people say peace advocacy efforts, we've been doing that. For example, when we're talking about human rights, activists, like a violation of human rights since 1965, 1998. We have this protest that is called Kamisan, or we do it every Thursday. Kamis is Thursday, so we do it every Thursday. We've been doing that for 600 times, like more than 600 times. And and the government never respond to that kind of issue. And we also do a lot of advocacy in terms of a lot of bills. My organization is focusing on the anti-sexual violence law and also the penal code law. And we have been I myself have been involved with advocating it for the past 3 years, and we've been doing a lot of stuff, and it seems like the government just never listen.
Oh my goodness, Nori, these bills right now, which are trying to be pushed through, but there have been some resistance, particularly from protesters like Anindya. What is it about the bills that people are unhappy about? Is there a change now in the politics of Indonesia?
Right. Just to give you a context. So the protest is happening actually because, there were growing dissatisfactions and grievances toward both president and the parliament. So it's not only the parliament who passed the bill in Indonesia, but you need an approval from the president as well. So the 2 bills were highly regarded by Indonesians. They were the criminal code bill and also the new bill on the anti-corruption commission, or what we call in Indonesia KPK. And when president and the parliament passed these 2 bills, there were no such thing as public consultancies. There's no public discussions whatsoever, and that's why people get angry because of that. And there were provisions, for instance, in the in the anti-corruption commission bill that will limit sort of the independency of the body in investigating corruption cases. And also it will, limit the special right of wiretapping of the body in investigating corruption cases, and also it will make it hard for the commission in recruiting its private investigators. So it will depend only on the police or public attorney as the sources of investigators.
So
However, the fact that
Nori, may I
yes.
just add something, because I want to bring in some of our community as well, because they want to weigh in on what is happening in Indonesia. So you have an anti-corruption commission, which is an independent body. So this is potentially being threatened by new bills or new legislation being pushed through. And Andri, who is a protester right now, is saying he is unhappy with the way that Indonesia is now treating corruption. Have a listen to him.
Corruption is a serious problem here. But look at our country now. Our government is making new law that crippled the effort of combating the corruptions. That is the compelling reasons why we are here, why the student and the protester is coming down to the street. How is it possible to eradicate the corruption if the government is actually does something like this? The situations where people having lack of trust to the public institutions, Corruption's Eradication Commission is like a hope for us. They are trying to break the only hope left. And of course, we won't let it happen.
Nori, can you help me understand why you would do something as legislators that might harm your own anti-corruption commission? Why would you do that?
Yeah, because why people really support the anti-corruption body, because it's simply the most trusted public institutions in Indonesia. It's a higher, even more higher than than president and also the military. So when the parliament passed the bill and then president approved the bill on KPK without any public consultations whatsoever, people got confused because corruption remains rampant in Indonesia. And the fact that when we democratized 20 years ago was simply because we believe that corruption has been deeply entrenched in our political systems, and that's why we set up a new independent and strong anti-corruption body, and that's why we remain. We still need them, to be investigating or to be eradicating corruption in our country. So the fact that both Parliament and President passed the bill that will weaken, debilitate the KPK is just unacceptable for many of us. Okay. So that's why I think people are protesting.
Sure. Anandia, this is a question that we have been asking at Al Jazeera for a little while. Have a look here on my laptop, asking why are there protests in Indonesia? We've been covering this story for the last couple of days and then even further than that. Answering that question, Johannes says, well, let's be clear. The main cause of this process is the dissatisfaction of people, especially university students, towards recent happenings in Indonesia, such as a riot in Papua, forest fire in Kalimantan and Sumatra, and then also, but the straw that broke the camel's back was the approval of two controversial laws. Noise helped us understand that a little bit more. And then from Gladys, thank you, Gladys, for this. The protests are covering wide-range national problems, and it is then summarised to 7 points of protest, or as people call it, the 7 desakan.
Desakan, yeah.
Yes, thank you. All right, boil it down for us. 7 points that you want your government to pay attention to. What's the most important?
Everything is important. All 7s are as important as any other, like the points that is in those 7 demands. So adding what Mas Nori said, like when we were talking about like the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission bills, the new one, and then also the penal code, what makes people frustrated, especially myself, I am frustrated because it seems like the government passed bills and passed bills that is, beneficial for them, but it's actually not something that the society needs. For example, the penal code, of course, we need a new penal code, but the revision itself somehow,
let me slow you down a little bit about the new penal code. Of course, we need a new penal code. If you know Indonesia, then you will know that it was a Dutch colony, and so a lot of the reasons why there's let's say, made a discussion over your legislation right now is because you want to replace the old colonial laws and bringing contemporary laws that are relevant to Indonesian society. So that is why Antonia says, well, we've got to replace the laws that we already have. Please continue.
But somehow the revisions, there's a lot of articles that, for me as a women's activist and like dealing with a lot of issues on sexual harassment, somehow there's a lot of articles at some point will criminalize a victim of rape, and in another, in a very contrary ways, we are trying to advocate to pass the anti-sexual violence bill, and it has been sitting on the legislative for the past 3 years. So it is something that we urgently need, but the government seems too reluctant to pass this bill. But like other bills that somehow not beneficial for the society, and beneficial for the government, and they pass the bill. So we cannot see, like, we cannot comprehend like what is actually the urgency of passing all of this, like non-beneficial bills to the society.
Yes, it does seem a little strange that some of the articles in this new legislation that's been put on hold for now is to do with people's personal lives, whether they are allowed to be intimate before they get married. Are they allowed to live together? Perhaps should they be wearing hijab or maybe not be wearing hijab? There's a whole list of these articles that are shaping society and maybe making society a little bit more conservative. Jeremy Menchik sent us this comment, and he framed it in this way. He thinks it's the vice president's influence. Have a listen. Have a look.
One of the most prominent backers of the legislation is Joko Widodo's Vice President Maruf Amin. Supporters of human rights and minority religions in Indonesia were really worried when Maruf Amin became vice president because of his connection with conservative Islamic organizations, as well as his ability to co-opt Islamic civil society. Those worries have turned out to be valid. With Maruf Amin in the vice presidential palace, we have good reason to worry about the future of democracy in Indonesia.
And India, you weigh in first, Nora, you go second.
I totally agree with that, because before the protests, I think Maruf Amin on behalf of his organization that is called MUI, it's an Islamic organization, I think one of the oldest Islamic organization in Indonesia. He actually made a statement that urging the legislative to pass the penal code bills and postponing or rejecting the anti-sexual violence bills. So it is definitely something that is very worrying, and especially, as I mentioned, like it's in a lot of ways the contra part of there's a lot of cons in terms of anti-sexual violence bills, and most of them are because of people seems to think that the anti-sexual violence bills is very liberal because there's a lot of concept of consent and power dynamics, and I think not many Indonesian actually understand what it means. So they think that it is something very liberal. So that's why conservative groups think that it will lead Indonesia into a country that doesn't have a religious base.
Okay, Nori, go ahead.
Yeah, that's very true. I think the choice of Jokowi in picking up Maruf Amin as his vice presidential candidate, and then they got elected, has led to this problem in terms of the penal code bill. But the thing is this: Indonesia is a democratic country, and then we essentially never adopt any kind of religious inspired regulations in our constitutions, except for one province, Aceh, in which you have Sharia law there. But that's a very special case because Aceh has this special autonomy province. But where the rest of other provinces in Indonesia, they adopt this kind of secular regulations in their provinces. But I also think that when the government proposed the bill on the penal code, they don't realize that the society is changing, especially the young people in Indonesia. So when they read the bills that will criminalize many of their personal freedom, their personal choice, banning extramarital sex, banning adultery, for instance, it's just unacceptable, I think,
Yeah.
for them. And so that's why, if you look at to the protests in Jakarta and in many other big cities in Indonesia, in which students come to the street to protest the content of the bill, you can tell that we have a changing society that is not being realized by the government.
Nori, I'm so glad you mentioned the students, because there's some remarkable video here from Daily Motion, and this takes us back to a student protest that was just last week. Let me play the video. So these students are pelting President Widodo's picture there. And just 5 years earlier, he was known as Indonesia's Obama. People really, really loved him. What has happened to his reputation in the interim?
Yeah, it's
Nori, you start, and then Anandia, you go second.
Okay.
Right. It's pretty much an irony, actually. If you look at to the way Jokowi came to power back in 2014, many regarded him as a new hope for Indonesian democracy, because he has no political ties to previous political establishment. He has no political dynasty whatsoever in Indonesia. So people really regarded him, high for Indonesian democracy. But I think it was in the second half of his second term, he became a more and more conservative president. If you remember back in 2016 or 17, there were very polarizing elections in Jakarta, in which you have the government, the candidate that got support from Islamic groups became the governor in the capital city of Indonesia. That makes, I think, Jokowi became a very different president, because he has, this threat from those Islamic groups who might threaten his power.
And indeed, what happened to the president's reputation? You were smiling there as you could see the students pelting him. Would you have been one of those students pelting, throwing tomatoes at him? Would that be you?
I honestly haven't seen the video. This is the first time I've seen this video.
You seem to be enjoying it very much.
It's just, for me, I completely agree with Nori said. It's very ironic to think about, how popular he was on his first term. A lot of people, as he mentioned, that it's a new hope. And I myself, one of the person who were very disappointed, but with the way he campaigned on his second term, especially on his first term, he mentioned a lot of stuff about human rights. Like, he will focus more on human rights, which is something that previous president never really talk about. But in his first term, he never done anything. Instead, there are more and more human rights violations, especially in Papua, and especially once he chose Ma'ruf Amin as a part of a conservative group, and he was actually one of the person who were very much involved in terms of, Anori mentioned about the the governor elections of Jakarta, which is the capital city of Indonesia. And he was one of the person who also kind of very much involved in, not pressing charge, but basically supporting the charge of blasphemy towards Basuki Cahayapurnama or Ahok. So there's a lot of disappointment in terms of, how he shifted. A lot of people say that, because a lot of people think right now that Jokowi's enemies are the students, but a lot of people also mention that actually his enemies are not the students, but his allies.
Right. Let me share this with you. This is from Bang Pitang. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us at the stream. On Twitter, he sent us a whole thread, but he also points out something that our guests here also mentioned, and he uses it, the Jokowi promises meme, what he promised 5 years ago and still hasn't fulfilled up to now. One of the voices, or an important voice that you haven't heard in this conversation, is the voice of the current government in Indonesia. So we wanted to bring in the Deputy Chief of Mission for the Indonesian Embassy in London. This is what he had to say about some of the things that we've been talking about during this show. Have a listen.
On the issues of the anti-corruptions, the law on anti-corruptions, the President Jokowi is considering legal options available, and one of these is to issue the presidential decree in lieu of law on anti-corruptions.
No, so it's still unclear what is going to be happening to some of this legislation. Do you have better clarity?
Yeah, I think President started to rethink, about his decisions in approving the bill on the anti-corruption commissions. He was kind of surprised in seeing, the massive protests led by the students, not only in Jakarta, but also in many other big cities in Indonesia. So that's why I think he started to think to issue what we call Perpu in Indonesia. It is a regulation in lieu of law to change the existing law on KPK. So I think that way, if the Perpu will be issued by the president, that could be a way out, for the crisis that we are having right now.
It's interesting because I was on the president's website, and from just last week, it feels like he's listening to you protesters. Let me show you a clip about what he is promising to do for Indonesian citizens. Have a look.
I want to strongly reiterate, my commitment to democratic life in Indonesia will not change. Freedom of the press, freedom of expression is a pillar of democracy that we must continue to guard and defend. Ladies and gentlemen, do not doubt my commitment on this.
And indeed, I should say that I actually pulled that off his YouTube channel, but does that make you feel better? Are you going to stop protesting now? Do you feel that the president's got your back?
Well, actually, the statement that he made, I think he made that last week, which it's quite an irony because he mentioned that he will keep the democracy alive and stuff like that. And then during the night, there are 2 human rights activists being arrested. So it kind of, for me, it feels like there's a lot of hypocrisy. It's very hypocrite for him to say something like that. But later on the same day, there are 2 human rights activists being arrested, and he never said anything. He never made comments about that. So I don't know. Call me skeptical, but I am skeptical.
So Nori, how do you think this might play out? You're a researcher, so you study democratic movements, how movements actually progress. How do you think this might play out in Indonesia? Do you think the students and the protesters have the upper hand right now?
Well, if you look at the student movement in Indonesia, it is actually a very political thing. If you look at 20 years ago, when we have the long-reign president of President Suharto, who's in power for more than 30 years, he was forced to step down by a massive protest led by the student in 1998. And the same was true for our first president, President Sukarno, who was also forced to step down by massive protests led by the students as well. So I think politicians in Indonesia, they have in their mind when students come to the street to protest about important political issues, they have to respond to their demand. Otherwise, worse thing might happen to them. And I think that's what President Jokowi did by thinking about issuing the regulation in lieu of law to change the already approved law on KPK. He is simply responding to the students' demand, the student concern.
And indeed, I know that you've been protesting. I just want to share this with you from Johannes on Twitter. Johannes says, we do have to acknowledge that the idealistic students managed to pressure the government. The problem is that political opportunists are jumping on the bandwagon. Remember I mentioned how many other issues there were to talk about that are happening in Indonesia, that people are protesting about. It's so broad. How do you succeed? Just in a sentence.
It's in a sentence. And well, I think it's because when we're mentioning about the protest, a lot of people, this is very identical to our students' protest, but we have to remember that the protest that we are doing is not just student, but it's layers of layers and, layers of civil society, from students, from women, from labor workers, fishermen, farmers, and every part of society are joining in, because every part of society will get affected if with these issues that we are protesting right now. So this is basically a coalition of people that basically are worried and also concerned about the democracy of Indonesia.
Anindya Rastaviani, thank you. Nori Ottariza. Thank you so much for helping us understand the protests going on in Indonesia so much better. See you next time. Take care, everybody.